Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Arena, and we have returned for one of our weekly series. This week, we're going to be taking a look at Life Gain Combo 2.0. So, for those who've been on the channel a little while, you may have seen this deck in the past. It actually survived rotation, though I do think it has been hurt a little bit since the cards have rotated. Like, Fumigate rotated out and we had to have Cleansing Nova and Settle the Wreckage in place. I do think that the Life Gain has been relevant. So there is that to go by. But what is Life Gain Combo in the first place? Well, it revolves around the card Primal Amulet. So Primal Amulet is a 4 mana artifact that says instants and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a charge counter on Primal Amulet. Then if there are 4 or more charge counters on it, you may remove those counters and transform it into Primal Wellspring. And Primal Wellspring basically says you can add 1 mana of any colour, and anything that uses that mana is copied if it's an instant or sorcery spell, of course. So the idea is that we want to flip our Primal Amulets and then combo off with Nexus of Fate, everybody's most hated card. Not seen this card played too much in a while, so I thought I'd bring it back in a bad way. 7 mana for an instant speed, take an extra turn after this one. Speaks for itself really, but if you imagine the combo with Primal Amulet, if we use the 7 mana to cast this spell, and one of those bits of mana is a Primal Wellspring, well, Nexus of Fate is a 7 mana take 2 extra turn spells, and that's really good. So how do we actually win the game? Well, there is 2 different ways of winning the game. The first and primary way of winning the game is using Banefire. So red and an X for a sorcery speed. Banefire deals X damage to any target, where X is the amount of mana we spend on it. And if X is 5 or more, this spell cannot be countered and the damage cannot be prevented. So this is the best way to fight any kind of controls as a win con. There is also Teferi as well. Teferi is 5 mana Planeswalker. The way that we win with Teferi is by ultimating him with the -8, which says when you get an emblem with whenever you draw a card, exile target permanent and opponent controls, and then from that point forward, every single turn that we draw a card, we exile a permanent that our opponent controls. Might even start with their lands or any threats that might get in the way of Teferi, and when they've got nothing left, what we'll then do is start tucking Teferi, because the -3 on Teferi here can target himself as well. Put target non-land permanent into its owner's library, 3rd from the top. And basically every single turn that we're exiling a permanent and our opponent is drawing a card, we are putting Teferi back into our deck, and when we do that, it basically means that we can't mill ourselves, and our opponent then draws 1 card every single turn until they've got nothing left. So that is the slowest and worst way of winning the game, but it's certainly a way of winning the game. And the reason why we're splitting Banefire with Teferi is because Unmoored Ego is a thing. So if they were to name Banefire, then we simply just wouldn't have any outs at all. So by splitting our win conditions, we basically fight against the possibility that our opponent might actually just name and exile one. So that's something to keep in mind. So how do we go about flipping Primal Amulet? Well, the basic structure of the deck is around Primal Amulet. So the idea is that we want to be flipping this as early as we possibly can. So we'll be casting it on turn 4, and by turn 5 we hope to actually be flipping it. So we use many different kinds of spells, but most of them are cantrips. So we have Opt, which is a 1 mana instant speed spell that scries 1 and replaces itself. So we get to go dig deep into our deck and then get another card that might add to the Primal Amulet count. Remember, we want to be casting as many instants and sorceries as we possibly can. We also have Revitalize as well, which is 1 and a white for an instant speed. Says you gain 3 life and it replaces itself. And you gotta bear in mind as well that there is cost reduction, so this is effectively 1 mana to do this as well. We also have 4 copies of Anticipate, which is effectively 1 mana with Primal Amulet. It allows us to look at the top 3 cards of our library and put 1 into our hand and the rest on the bottom, essentially replacing itself, and you get to see the theme here. Finally, we have Ritual of Rejuvenation, which is 2 and a white. So this one actually costs 2, because we can't really get any more 1 mana cantrips, unfortunately. This one says you gain 4 life and you draw a card, so it's a slightly more powerful version than Revitalize, but for 1 extra mana. We do also have Chemister's Insight, but I don't really count that in the cantrip kind of fashion. It is a really good thing to use on a Primal Wellspring though, because when you copy Chemister's Insight you end up drawing 4 cards for 4 mana, which is pretty good. And the Jumpstart allows us to discard one of our excess lands or one of our unused spells to do it all over again the next turn. So, we also have, in addition to all of those things as well, for filtering, Search for Azcanta, which is a 1 and a blue legendary enchantment. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to essentially surveil without the surveil keyword. You get to look at the top card of your library and you can put it into your graveyard if you want, or leave it on top. And if you have 7 more cards in your library, which you can imagine with all of these cantrips is very, very easy to do, then you get to transform Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin. So we could be flipping our Azcanta as soon as turn 4 or turn 5, depending on the structure of our hand, but filling our graveyard up with a lot of cantrips is a really good way of flipping Azcanta. Azcanta then turns into a blue land that also has the ability to pay 3, tap itself, 4 mana total, to look at the top 4 cards of our library and reveal a non-creature, non-land card from them and put it into your hand. So other than lands, this hits absolutely everything in our deck, so it's really powerful effect on the Azcanta. It's a great way to flip the tables in a control matchup as well. Azcanta on turn 2 usually means that you win against control, unless they've got one of their own or find a way to deal with it. Really early game threat for that situation. Speaking of control, we do also have Sinister Sabotage as well. A 3 mana counter spell. Really did need these in the end. I tried playing this without counter spells, but you can't really protect all of the stuff that you really need to, unfortunately. So we are running 4 copies of Sinister Sabotage, which counters any spell that we absolutely need to do. Also Surveils as well. It should be noted that Surveil is actually quite powerful in this deck, because when we are cantripping and filtering and Search for Azcantering, we're thinning our deck. And when we thin our deck, obviously, the size of our deck becomes lower and the odds of drawing the cards that we need ever increase. So once we've got our Primal Amulet down on the field, we really just want to be thinning our deck as much as humanly possible, because the less cards there are in it, it basically means that the odds of drawing Nexus of Fate ever increase. So if you've ever seen Turbo Fog, the way that they win, they said that basically if they got to 30 cards in their deck, they had a Teferi or a Search flipped in that case. If they had 30 cards, the odds of drawing a Nexus become insanely high, and then from there, you just keep drawing Nexuses, keep drawing Nexuses. The same kind of applies to our deck as well. We don't really go off that good, because the old Turbo Fog list had Nissas to scry and Khans and things like that. We only have 1 copy of Teferi, but really we probably will just only have 1 Search for Azcanta, but the theory still applies for us. The thinner our deck is, the more likely we are to draw Nexus, and then the more times we chain it with the Primal Wellspring, the more likely we are to win. So it's a nice little snowballing effect. So to protect us against creatures, in addition to all of the counter spells that we also have 2 copies of Settle the Wreckage, which exiles all attacking creatures, and then they get as many lands as they were attacking creatures onto the battlefield tapped. The increase ramp in terms of our opponent is not usually too bad, because we do actually have a Primal Amulet down on that point, and it's really just a matter of flipping the Amulet and waiting until we get Nexus of Fate until we win. So the increased amount of mana that our opponent can get usually doesn't matter too much. But we also have 2 copies of Cleansing Nova as well, as a 5 mana board wipe. We're splitting these mostly because sometimes against heavy aggro decks you actually want to have the turn 4 board wipe. Sometimes turn 5 just isn't quick enough, which is why I've been splitting them the way that I have. But anyway, Cleansing Nova is a 5 mana sorcery speed board wipe to destroy all creatures, but there is also the secondary part there to destroy all artifacts and enchantments. Sometimes we can actually have our opponent Ixalan's Binding, our Primal Amulet or our Teferi or something like that, and that might actually really slow us down. So being able to destroy all artifacts and enchantments is very powerful on that one as well. You do have to worry about your Primal Amulets and your Search for Azcantas, but Amulets flip and so do Azcantas. So there is obviously the occasion where maybe Primal Amulet has 3 counters on it. You can actually Cleansing Nova with Destroy All Artifacts and Enchantments, and it will flip in response to protect itself, which is kind of cool. So something to keep in mind there. Other than that though, the deck is pretty simple. We've got 9 plains, 10 islands, and 4 glacial fortresses. We don't really need the colourless lands all that much, because we don't really care about rival Azcantas, we don't care about our opponent getting Archer Veraska online or anything like that, because the game is usually over by the time we've flipped our Amulet. So we're just running a nice plain mana base here, just to make sure that our deck functions as intended. So that's the main deck. Onto the sideboard, we've got 2 copies of Sentinel Totem, a 1-mana artifact, and when it enters the battlefield you scry 1, but the purpose of this card is basically to play against graveyard decks. Most of the time though, the graveyard isn't going to matter too much, but I like just having a little bit of interaction with them all the same. So we get to exile all cards from their graveyards when it actually matters. It does hit our own graveyard though, so yet again there's something to consider, that you might have a Chemister's Insight in your graveyard. For the most part though, the graveyard for us doesn't matter, other than trying to flip a Searchful Canter. There is really no use on the graveyard at all. 4 copies of Gideon's Reproach, just in case we come up against aggro, because it is one of the things that would get in the way of us winning. So Gideon's Reproach is a 1 and a white, instant speed. Gideon's Reproach deals 4 damage to attacking or blocking creature. The reason we're running this over, say, Seal Away is because it's also an instant as well, so it triggers the Primal Amulet. So Seal Away would be better if it weren't for the synergy that Gideon's Reproach actually provides. And 4 damage to a creature isn't actually anything too terrible at all. It hits most of the creatures in the format. There are a few things like Doom Whisperer, Niv Mizzet, you know, some of the really big hitters that just don't die to Gideon's Reproach, but for the most part this actually catches anything that is required to hit in the early game, because hopefully Doom Whisperers and Niv Mizzets shouldn't matter too much, because maybe we'll Ixalan's Binding them. This allows us to get rid of any permanents that we are really struggling with on our opponent's side of the board. So Planeswalkers, big creatures that we just can't wipe away or something like that. 3 and a white for this one, for the enchantment. Exiles target non-land permanent opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and your opponents cannot cast spells with the same name as the exiled card. So if we exile our opponent's Teferi, for example, they can no longer play Teferi, so we don't have to worry about that card. You do have to worry about Ixalan's Binding on Ixalan's Binding. That has happened to me in one game before, but I actually ended up winning that game because I drew Cleansing Nova, blew up their Ixalan's Binding with the secondary part of Cleansing Nova, which released my Ixalan's Binding to take out their Teferi, and they scooped pretty shortly after. It was kind of hilarious. Against control as well, though, we do actually almost turn into a control deck ourselves. We have 3 copies of Negate to counter target non-creature spell, and I'm running a questionable card. I'm just testing it out, really. Unwind, which is essentially Negate. 3 mana total, 2 and a blue, so it's 1 mana extra to do exactly what Negate does, but we do have the cost reduction, and it also allows us to untap up to 3 lands. So it's basically a 2 mana, if we count Primal Amulet in place. This is the reason why I'm testing it out. It's a 2 mana Negate that actually untaps a land and ramps, which is something to be aware of. I'm not sure how much that's actually going to play into it, but we could unwind, untap 3 lands and have, what, 4 mana total at that point, which is pretty good indeed. And then Settle the Wreckage and Cleansing Novas, just in case we have creature decks to come up against. It's always nice to have a few extra board wipes, and I think 6 is very overkill, so, you know, I love to overkill against creature decks. It's kind of fun. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it for the deck tech. Be sure to go down into the description below. There'll be a deck list down there that you can export to Magic Arena if you do want to try and play out this deck. As I mentioned, it is not as good as it used to be, though I think it's still pretty fun all the same. And when Azorius comes around, I'm sure we'll get all of the pieces to add to this deck as well. I was a little hesitant to actually play this deck, actually, because I knew that Azorius would be coming around. We'd probably revisit this deck anyway, but maybe we'll do it a 3rd time. I don't know. Depends on how much you guys enjoy these decks, or this deck in particular. And if you did enjoy it, the best way to let me know is by liking, subscribing, hitting that little bell icon, and that'll give you notifications when I release videos in the future. The matches should be up now, and there'll be a link to them at the end of this video and down in the description below. I hope you guys enjoy, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.